Footsteps in the Night Study Hall, based on a real student's experience. I used to stay late at school during the year I was preparing for university exams. Most nights, the building emptied out early, leaving just a handful of us scattered across different classrooms. But one night, everyone else went home much earlier than usual. By 9 p.m., I was the only student left on the entire floor. My classroom sat at the very end of the corridor. Beyond it was the old wing of the school, a section that had been closed off years before I ever enrolled. Teachers said the foundation had shifted, that part of the ceiling collapsed, that it wasn't safe anymore, whatever the reason. No one ever went past that locked steel door, just sat there collecting dust, separating the living part of the school from the part that had been forgotten. That night the silence felt different, not peaceful, heavy, oppressive, the kind that amplifies every tiny sound your body makes. I could hear the scratch of my pencil, the soft tapping of my heartbeat in my ears, even the static buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. About an hour in, the lights flickered, not a blackout, just a quick, nervous tremble. Then everything went still again. I pushed it out of my mind and went back to studying. A few minutes later I heard it, footsteps, very slow, very deliberate, coming from the direction of the old wing. I froze. No one should have been there, not teachers, not janitors, no one. The wing was sealed off with caution tape and a metal door that could only be opened with a school-issued key. Yet the footsteps kept coming, steady as a heartbeat, echoing softly through the empty building. Except something was wrong with the sound. They weren't crisp like shoes on tile. They were dull, weighted, almost as if someone heavy was walking across thick, rotten wood. But the floors in that section were pure concrete. I knew because I would seen them draw a crack once. The steps crept closer, 10 meters away, 5, 3. My throat dried out. I stood up slowly, expecting to see a teacher, a guard, even a stray animal, anything grounded in reality. When I opened the classroom door and looked into the corridor, it was empty, completely empty. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved past my doorway, then they moved through the wall across from me. That's when the realization hit me like ice water down my back. The footsteps weren't in the hallway, they were inside the wall. It sounded like someone was pacing slowly, steadily, from within the concrete itself, as if another corridor existed parallel to ours. Just inches behind the plaster, each step vibrated through the wall, heavy and unnatural. I backed into the classroom, heart thundering in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was pipes, old machinery, maybe even an animal nesting, but no, pipes don't walk, animals don't march in perfect rhythm, and nothing else should move inside a wall that thick. When the footsteps reached the place directly opposite me, they stopped. A long, suffocating silence followed. Then one single tap, right at eye level, on the other side of the wall. It was faint but intentional, like a knock meant specifically for me. My legs nearly gave out. I grabbed my bag and sprinted down the hallway without looking back. I didn't care if the lights were off, if I heard something chasing me, if shadows played tricks on me. I just needed to get out before whatever was inside that wall decided to step out of it. The next morning, I asked a few teachers if they had gone near the old wing the night before. They all said the same thing. No one had touched that section in years. The door was still sealed. Dust on the floor remained undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of entry, nothing. But I know what I heard. I know what walked behind that wall. And to this day, whenever I study alone in a quiet building, I can't shake the memory of those slow, heavy steps tracing the concrete, searching, pacing, waiting, waiting for someone to listen again. The list of missing students, based on a real incident in a school basement archive. I always hated the basement level of my school. Even during daytime, the place felt wrong. The air heavy, the lights dim, and the silence so dense it felt like it had weight. Nobody went down there unless a teacher specifically sent them. So when my history teacher told me to check the old archive room for documents, a knot formed instantly in my stomach. I tried to hide my hesitation, but the dread followed me step by step as I descended the concrete stairs. The farther down I went, the colder the air became. It didn't feel like normal basement cold. It felt stagnant, as if the air hadn't moved in years. The door to the archive room was old, dented, and covered in scratches. Some looked like they were made by tools, others by fingernails. I pushed it open and was greeted by a stale wave of dusty, stagnant air, the kind that sticks to your lungs. The room was bigger than I expected. Rows of shelves stretched into the dimness, stacked with boxes, blenders, and folders that probably hadn't been touched in decades. The only window was a small, clouded square near the ceiling, impossible to see through. I walked between the shelves, fingers trailing across spines coated in thick dust. Most of the binders were faded, their labels unreadable. I was about to give up when something caught my eye. A thin brittle binder wedged between two thick ledgers. It was cleaner than the others, as if it had been placed there recently. I pulled it free, dust drifted into the air like ash. On the front page, typed in old, uneven letters, was a title that made my scalp tighten. Missing students. I told myself it was probably a list of students who transferred or dropped out. But when I started flipping through the pages, my heart sank. The names were dated years apart: 1987, 1993, 2002, 2011. Each entry labeled the same way, disappeared on the school grounds. Every name felt heavier than the last. There were no explanation, no notes, no follow-ups, just a date of disappearance in silence. Then I reached the final page, at the very bottom of the list, printed in the same faded typeface as the others, was my name, right there, staring back at me from decades old paper. And next to it, today's date. My breath hitched, my pulse hammered so hard I could barely hear. I searched desperately for a logical explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone was playing a prank. But the ink wasn't new. It wasn't handwriting. It wasn't recent. It looked like it had been on that page for years. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. And then they dimmed so low that the room looked swallowed by shadow. Something moved outside the dusty window, a silhouette drifting across the glass, then another and another. Their shapes were faint, blurred, but unmistakably human, like figures trapped behind fog, passing slowly by, as if still roaming the basement after all these years. A cold shiver crept down my spine. I shut the binder and backed toward the door. I didn't want to know what those silhouettes were. I didn't want to stay long enough to find out. When I reached the exit and grabbed the handle, the door slammed shut by itself. The metal rang out through the basement, echoing like a warning bell. I twisted the handle. It wouldn't move. I pulled harder. It stayed locked. The lights flickered again, and the shadows in the corners deepened. The air grew colder, my breath fogged, and then I felt it. A slow, steady exhale on the back of my neck. Not a draft, not imagination. Breathe, human breathe. I could turn around, my body locked in place. Something was behind me, close enough to touch me, close enough to whisper. The silence thickened, pressing into my ears, until I could hear nothing but the blood rushing through my head. I don't remember making the decision to move. I just remember throwing my weight against the door so hard that it burst open. I stumbled into the hallway and sprinted up the stairs, not looking back, afraid that if I did, something would be following me. By the time I reached the main floor, the air felt warm again, the lights felt alive again. But the terror stayed inside my chest long after I left the building. The next morning, after convincing myself I had imagined everything, I returned to the basement and needed proof I was losing my mind. I walked into the archive room, marched straight to the shelf, where I would find the binder. It wasn't there. I checked every shelf, every box, every drawer, nothing. The binder didn't just disappear, it had never existed, not physically, not visibly. But I know what I held, I know what I saw, I know what breathed behind me in that darkness. And sometimes when I walk past old bulletin boards or outdated attendance sheets, I catch myself searching for my name, wondering if somewhere in the hidden parts of that school I am already listed as missing. The final note in the music room, based on a real incident inside a school's old arts building. My music teacher always told me that late night practice built character, that the quiet of empty arts building made it easier to focus, easier to feel the instruments, easier to breathe with the music. But the arts building at night never felt peaceful to me. It felt abandoned in a way that didn't belong to the present, like it remembered things the rest of us had forgotten. The hallways were dim long before sunset, the wooden floors creaked in long, uneven tones, and the air always smelled like dust trapped inside old sheet music. Still, I pushed myself to practice for the competition. One evening around 8 p.m., the building was silent except for the soft notes of the piano echoing through the empty rooms. I was alone, or at least I should have been. Halfway through my piece, another sound threaded itself through the silence. A single trembling note, not from a piano, from a violin. Except it wasn't the clean tone of tuned instruments, it was warped, strained, like someone dragging a bow across broken strings. The sound wavered in and out, growing louder even though no one else should have been playing the building. I lifted my hands from the piano keys. The note continued. It came from the practice room next door. A chill crawled up my spine. I told myself it had to be the wind, even though there was no wind inside the building. Eventually, curiosity pushed fear aside, and I followed the sound. My footsteps were the only thing breaking the suffocating silence. When I opened the door to the next room, the violin stopped instantly. The room was empty, completely still. The only thing inside was an old, cracked violin lying in the center of the floor and a thin notebook resting beside it. Dust covered everything except a perfect outline around the violin. As if someone had moved it recently, I knelt down and picked up the notebook. On the first page, written in trembling handwriting, was a single sentence. The one who plays the final note can never return. Nothing else, no date, no explanation. I remembered then years ago, a music student had died in the building. Rumors said he practiced alone late at night. Some said he disappeared before he died. No one ever talked about it directly, but the older teachers always avoided the arts building after dark. Before I could flip the page, the violin let out another note by itself. This time it sounded inches away from me. Cold air flooded the room. My breath came out in white clouds. The temperature dropped so fast my fingers numbed instantly. The note grew louder and longer, like a warning cry. The wooden floor vibrated beneath my knees. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was too terrified to move. I felt a presence behind me, not footsteps, not movement, just a pressure in the air, like the atmosphere itself thickened. I forced myself to turn toward the mirror on the wall. I was alone, but my reflection wasn't. Standing next to my reflection was a shape, a shadow darker than the room itself, tall and utterly still. It didn't touch me, but in the glass its form leaned closer, as if whispering something into the ear of my reflection. I spun around. No shadow, nobody there. But the mirror still showed it, watching me, studying whether I would play the final note. I dropped the notebook and bolted out of the room. My footsteps hammered the hallway as the violin wailed behind me, each note twisting into something more desperate, more angry. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the building and into the cold night air. I didn't sleep that night. I barely ate the next day. But I convinced myself it was a hallucination, stress, imagination, anything that made sense in daylight. I was wrong. The next evening, during rehearsal on the auditorium stage, I placed my fingers on the piano keys. Just the slightest pressure, not even a full note, and from behind the curtain came that same distorted violin tone, longer this time, clearer, as if it recognized me, as if it had been waiting for me. I froze, hands suspended over the piano, unable to move or breathe. The stage lights flickered, something shifted in the darkness backstage, and above the final, trembling violin note, I could almost hear a whisper. Finish the song. I haven't practiced along since, but sometimes when I pass the arts building at night, I swear I hear that violin again, faint, distant, and getting closer every week.